Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. He told dispatch Amy shot herself, but I've taken 911 calls long enough to know when someone's lying. And that man sounded more rehearsed than rattled. At 12:15 p.m. on May 8, 2018, a veteran detective dialed 911 from his own home. Brian Fannion, an officer with over 30 years in law enforcement, calmly reported the death of his wife, Amy Fannion. His voice was measured. The call was brief. He claimed she had shot herself with his department-issued firearm following an argument. When first responders arrived, the scene was quiet, controlled, almost too controlled. Amy was found in the master bathroom. A .45 caliber Glock lay nearby. A single gunshot wound to the right side of her head had ended her life instantly, or so it appeared. She was barefoot. No blood smears across the room. No signs of a struggle. Brian told investigators he had stepped out of the room after the fight and returned to find her dead. He maintained that she had used his weapon, retrieved from its locked case. Standard procedure followed. Crime scene secured, weapon bagged, body documented. Westfield police contacted Massachusetts State Police immediately. Despite Brian's badge, or perhaps because of it, the department knew this would demand outside oversight. To observers, the Fannions had lived a quiet life. Church-going, no domestic calls. Married for over 3 decades. 2 adult children. Amy was 51, a homemaker. She tended to her garden, was known to cook for community events. The marriage to those around them seemed stable. But in homicide investigations, surface normalcy is often camouflage, the first layer peeled away during the initial walkthrough. Crime scene technicians noted the lack of blood spatter consistent with a close-range gunshot. The wound was clean, almost surgical. No stippling on the skin, no soot pattern. Typically, a suicide involving a contact wound leaves residue, gunshot residue, GSR, visible to the eye and definitely detectable to lab instruments. But Amy's wound lacked both. Detectives reviewed the scene again. The Glock had been fired once. The magazine held 13 rounds, 12 remained. The gun slide was locked open. The expended casing was found a few feet from Amy's head. Her body position raised additional concerns. It was unnatural. The pistol was on her left side, but the bullet had entered from the right. Amy was right-handed, but something still felt wrong about the angle. A trained eye would call it inconsistent, and investigators on scene did. Crime scene photography preserved everything. A forensic pathologist was called to ensure consistency between wound trajectory and physical environment. Early assessments noted something subtle. Amy's right hand bore no visible signs of having discharged a firearm. No GSR, no bruising, no blowback, no trace metals. It wasn't conclusive, but it wasn't nothing. Back at headquarters, one sergeant remarked, "Everything about this case moves too fast, too conveniently." Another officer added, "Fannion knows procedure, maybe too well." Still, no arrests, no formal charges. Just a growing file and a lingering sense of doubt. Detectives began the first of many interviews. Brian repeated his timeline. He'd come home on lunch break. They'd argued. He used the bathroom. When he emerged, she was already dead. He denied any affair, denied any tension. Claimed Amy had a history of emotional volatility, a suggestion that didn't sit well with those who knew her. A timeline reconstruction showed less than 15 minutes from the time he arrived to the 911 call. Not impossible, but tight. A second review of Amy's phone found no suicide notes, no final messages. Her calendar showed a dental appointment 2 days later, a saved Pinterest board for summer garden upgrades. No evidence she had been preparing for anything except everyday life. Autopsy scheduling was expedited. Meanwhile, the scene was reevaluated under ultraviolet. No additional GSR patterns emerged, no secondary blood patterns. The bathroom showed no prints on the weapon other than Amy's faint touch on the grip. Possibly post-mortem transfer, not active use. A digital forensic tech reviewing Brian's department-issued phone flagged something odd. The browser history included search terms like gunshot residue patterns, spouse suicide protocol, and pension after spouse death. The searches predated Amy's death by about a week. These weren't yet enough to prove intent, but they weren't easily ignored either. One detective confided in notes later subpoenaed, "The data aligns too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. When a crime scene looks like it was built to pass inspection, it usually wasn't spontaneous. Brian had not yet been charged. His badge hadn't been pulled, but the investigation had pivoted. The case, once seen as a possible tragedy, was now officially being treated as a suspicious death. By May 10, 2018, just 48 hours after Amy Fanion's death, the first forensic inconsistencies had been logged. It was no longer about visual anomalies. The autopsy report had begun to form a picture that contradicted the initial narrative. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Boston completed the preliminary examination by the end of that week. Amy had sustained a single gunshot wound to the right temporal region. The bullet entered cleanly, coursed leftward, slightly downward, and exited near the left occipital. Brain matter displacement and trajectory matched a mid-range ballistic path. But here was the issue. There was no muzzle imprint, no evidence of contact firing. Her hair remained largely intact around the entry point, indicating the shot had not been delivered with the barrel pressed to the skin. That mattered. In most firearm suicides, especially those involving handguns, the weapon is placed directly against the head. Contact wounds leave clear indicators: burned tissue, soot embedding, stellate tearing. Amy's lacked all of these. This wasn't just unusual, it was procedurally inconsistent with a self-inflicted gunshot wound from a trained adult, who presumably would know how to handle a firearm. Even with no prior experience, a suicide rarely executes such precision from a distance. Then came the second issue. Her dominant hand, the right, showed no GSR, gunshot residue, upon full-spectrum swabbing. Her left hand had trace residue, though it was minimal. Analysts noted the possibility of transfer, especially considering the position she was found in. But residue alone isn't definitive. It's cumulative evidence that matters. A secondary trajectory review was conducted using 3D scanning. Laser modeling placed Amy in a seated position on the bathroom floor. The bullet path intersected the wall behind her, embedding into drywall approximately 58 inches above ground level. Backtracking the projectile angle yielded a downward slope from right to left, an awkward angle for self-delivery unless the firearm was extended at an unnatural pitch or handled by a person not sitting. Crime scene documentation indicated that Amy's legs were extended and her torso slightly tilted left, but the blood pool was localized and neat. Unusual for a fatal headshot, the lack of arterial spray furthered concern. Either her heart stopped instantly, unlikely, or the scene had been cleaned or arranged. No chemical signs of cleanup were found, but absence of evidence isn't confirmation of truth. The report also confirmed no defensive wounds, no signs of bruising, no broken fingernails, no restraint marks. That at least aligned with the original claim of no struggle, but the wounds and position still raised doubts. Quiet doesn't mean voluntary. Investigators re-interviewed Brian Fanion on May 12th under administrative advisement. He maintained his account verbatim. Argument over faith, emotional instability, brief separation for de-escalation, discovery of her body upon return. A detective noted in his report, repeat testimony without natural deviation over multiple sessions can signal rehearsal. Human memory isn't a script. A third-party forensic pathologist was asked to review the findings. Their independent conclusion reinforced the first. The injury pattern was inconsistent with self-inflicted characteristics under normal suicidal presentation. Language carefully chosen. The department was under scrutiny. A uniformed detective as a potential suspect, even if unnamed, demanded procedural perfection. The community hadn't yet reacted. No leaks, no rumors. Publicly, this remained a tragic suicide. Privately, investigators were building a slow, layered profile of contradiction. Digital forensic analysis had now become the next focus. But before turning to the devices, they needed to lock the physical narrative. Every angle of the projectile, every spray pattern, every distance calculation. They returned to the house on May 14th with laser guides, trajectory rods, and ballistic gel. Reconstructing the angle live. It didn't add up. A firearm fired by a seated person should have ejected casing downward or adjacent. The casing in Amy's case had traveled nearly 4 feet, odd for a direct point-blank delivery. More critically, the wall indentation from the bullet strike was slightly off-center from Amy's shoulder alignment. just enough to raise technical doubt. For now, the scene was still formally classified undetermined. Not homicide, not suicide. A limbo that stalled charges but accelerated suspicion. Procedurally, investigators were cautious. Misstep in a case involving a police officer could invalidate findings or introduce civil challenges. They began bringing in outside consultants, former FBI analysts, retired homicide instructors, to audit methodology. Their consensus: trajectory does not support the official story. No arrests, no press releases. But a case file quietly labeled possible stage suicide began circulating internally. The last item reviewed before transitioning to digital forensics, a handwritten notation in Amy's day planner. Brian says God forgives everything, but I don't think that includes betrayal. Undated, unverified, but found beneath a to-do list for May 7th, just one day before her death. By the end of May 2018, the physical evidence was no longer carrying the weight alone. Autopsy reports had established trajectory anomalies. There was no contact wound, no blood spray pattern typical of a suicide, and no GSR on Amy Fanion's dominant hand. Each of those discrepancies mattered individually, but collectively, they made it impossible for investigators to ignore a growing suspicion. This wasn't self-inflicted. Still, suspicion without proof meant nothing. And in modern homicide cases, proof often isn't found at the crime scene. It's pulled from devices, cloud logs, and metadata. On May 28th, Massachusetts State Police received access to Brian Fanion's department-issued laptop and personal devices under a digital forensic warrant. The results arrived in packets, not drama, but the contents were definitive in their own way. First was the browser history. In the weeks leading up to Amy's death, Brian's laptop had logged a sequence of searches considered unusual for someone in his role and with his claimed knowledge. Investigators documented search terms that included gunshot residue patterns on skin and hair, will a Glock leave burns in close-range firing, how to erase metadata from a weapon discharge, suicide investigation procedure, Massachusetts, can you keep pension if spouse dies suddenly? All searches were conducted between April 12th and May 4th, less than 1 month before Amy's death. Timestamps placed most of them in the early afternoon, off-duty hours midweek. They originated from his home IP address, not his patrol car terminal. A forensic analyst noted, there is no professional justification for this search behavior within the scope of Brian Fanion's assigned duties. It was documented, logged, sealed with chain of custody. Then came the messages. Though Brian had handed over his personal phone voluntarily, a device extraction revealed that he had deleted over 200 texts between himself and a woman named Corey Knowles. She was a co-worker, also in law enforcement, with whom he had recently traveled for a department conference. The deletion was not subtle. The last 10 days of communication were wiped clean. Messages, call logs, attachments. However, Fanion failed to account for cloud sync across devices. A backup recovered from a personal iCloud account included extensive correspondence dating back 6 months. The tone shifted noticeably in the weeks prior to Amy's death, from professional exchanges to romantic innuendo to outright emotional intimacy. One message sent 3 days before the incident read, I just want peace, a clean life, you and me, no drama, just us. Another sent the morning of May 7th. It won't be long now, I promise. Then it's our time. On May 8th, the day Amy died, no messages were found between them. Investigators found that unusual, given their daily contact pattern. When questioned later, Corey claimed she had distanced herself after sensing emotional volatility. Her account would later be scrutinized, but at this stage, it added pressure. Amy's phone was examined next. There were no text messages indicating suicidal thoughts, no voicemails expressing despair. Her emails included multiple confirmations for dentist and optometrist appointments in June and July. Her Amazon account had recent purchases, gardening gloves, canning jars, and devotional journals. None of it aligned with imminent self-harm. Most revealing, perhaps, was Amy's activity within a private email draft folder. Forensic recovery identified a partially written letter dated May 2nd. It was untitled and unsent. Its content wasn't explicit, but investigators noted one line that stood out. I'm scared of what happens if I push back. He says God forgives anything, but I don't think that includes deception. The device metadata placed her in the home on May 8th between 11:45 a.m. and 12:13 p.m., the precise time window in which Brian claimed she had shot herself. There were no calls, no sent texts, no outgoing emails during that window. Her phone went dark at 12:14 p.m., moments before the 911 call was placed. Simultaneously, data from Brian's smartwatch, which he had not disclosed to investigators, was obtained through a subpoena to the manufacturer. It showed elevated heart rate starting at 12:08 p.m. Not unusual for someone witnessing trauma, but curious when paired with the fact that Brian claimed to have been in the bathroom at that time, unaware anything had happened. The watch also recorded movement, a brief, sharp spike in arm motion logged at 12:09 p.m., followed by 5 minutes of near-complete stillness. The data aligned, maybe too well. Investigators began outlining what they called the silent minute, the interval where Amy's phone activity ceased, Brian's smartwatch spiked, and the gun discharged. That gap, once seen as an unfortunate blur, was now the focal point of a timeline under challenge. Digital forensics rarely tell a full story, but they're impartial. They don't grieve. They don't rationalize. They show sequences, time, frequency, deletion. And in this case, the sequence was becoming a blueprint for premeditation. Internally, law enforcement debated the optics of pressing charges. Fannion was still a decorated officer. His file showed commendations, not complaints. But the data didn't care. It wasn't anecdotal. It didn't require interpretation. By June 5th, the case had shifted formally from undetermined death to homicide pending evidence clearance. No arrests yet, no media statements. But the tone inside the task force had changed, quietly, permanently. By mid-June 2018, the case file had crossed 200 pages. What began as a domestic suicide call now resembled a homicide inquiry with multiple forensic inconsistencies and a timeline compromised by digital evidence. Investigators had moved past the physical scene. The next phase required direct human interaction, interviews, credibility assessments, and behavioral analysis. The focus shifted to personal circles, family, co-workers, and Corey Knowles. The first point of contact was Amy's brother. His statement, taken on June 15th, outlined what investigators already suspected. Amy hadn't expressed suicidal thoughts. She had, however, voiced concerns about her marriage, not in dramatic terms, but with cautious phrases. She had told her brother she felt isolated and unseen. These weren't red flags on their own, but in context they challenged the claim that her death was an impulsive act of despair. More critical was the interview with Amy's sister-in-law, who shared that Amy had recently asked for contact information for a divorce attorney. That conversation happened approximately 2 weeks before her death. She didn't mention violence, only that she needed to think through her options. The attorney had not been contacted. No appointment had been made. Still, intent matters. Detectives then focused on Brian Fannion's co-workers. In 2 separate interviews, supervisors recalled changes in his behavior following a department-sponsored trip to Mexico in March 2018. One sergeant described him as distracted, always on his phone, more private than usual. These observations weren't actionable, but when paired with digital records confirming romantic messaging with Corey Knowles during that period, they added to a pattern of concealment. Corey was interviewed under subpoena on June 21st. Her demeanor was neutral. She acknowledged the personal nature of her conversations with Brian, but denied any physical relationship. She claimed their discussions were emotional support, framed around mutual frustrations. When shown messages extracted from backup, specifically those referencing a future together, she hesitated but didn't change her story. She stated that Brian was venting, not making promises. Investigators noted that Corey's phone had also undergone factory reset on May 9th, 1 day after Amy's death. The data had been recovered, but the timing was relevant. She claimed it was routine, unrelated to the case. The move raised suspicion but didn't constitute obstruction. In parallel, a review of Brian's time logs showed that on the morning of Amy's death, he was on an administrative shift that allowed him to return home midday without notification. He wasn't tracked by GPS. The policy allowed for lunch breaks to be spent off-site. This detail, while procedurally standard, meant he had opportunity. An opportunity, when combined with motive and forensic conflict, elevated the threat posture of the case. A behavioral profiler was consulted to review interview transcripts and Brian's written statements. The profiler noted consistency in phrasing that could indicate scripting. Specifically, his repeated use of the phrase, "she must have felt hopeless," appeared in 3 different interviews across 2 weeks. Repetition of emotionally loaded language, without deviation, often signals rehearsed storytelling rather than spontaneous recollection. But it was Brian's interaction with the family that drew the strongest reaction from investigators. At Amy's funeral, he reportedly avoided personal contact with both children and did not speak with Amy's mother. These behaviors alone don't prove guilt, but they challenge expectations. According to one family member, he acted like someone who'd already moved on. When questioned again on June 26th, Brian was still cooperative. He denied planning anything. He reiterated that Amy had emotional issues. He said he felt trapped in the marriage, but not enough to hurt her. When asked about the forensic inconsistencies, lack of stippling, odd bullet trajectory, message deletions, he either had no explanation or deferred to experts. He invoked his right to end the interview after 47 minutes. The investigation team paused formal interviews and began assembling their timeline board in full. Physical data, digital timelines, behavioral shifts, all aligned in sequence. Opportunity, stressor, forensic anomaly, post-incident deletion. Yet no single item proved murder. The case was circumstantial, stacked, but not nailed. As of late June 2018, Amy's death was still classified as suspicious under review. The district attorney's office declined to file charges pending further corroboration. But within the task force, consensus had hardened. They weren't looking at a suicide. They were looking at someone who knew the system too well to leave fingerprints. By July 2018, the physical evidence in the Fanyon case had stopped speaking in whispers. The data, the behavior, the inconsistencies, none of it screamed, but it didn't need to. It accumulated. Still, the one thing holding investigators back was what they didn't have: a decisive link between Amy's physical injuries and intentional action. The autopsy report was solid, but it was cautious. Inconsistent with self-inflicted, not clearly inflicted by another. That phrasing mattered. Prosecutors needed more than suspicion and digital residue. They needed anatomy. That's when the district attorney's office authorized a private forensic review. The second autopsy wasn't a full re-examination. It was a review of the existing photos, tissue samples, wound analysis, and ballistic modeling, done off-site by an independent forensic pathologist with no connection to local law enforcement. The purpose was simple: confirm whether the initial conclusions could hold up in court and whether anything had been missed under the assumption of suicide. The results came back after 3 weeks. The private examiner, Dr. Carla Mendoza, issued a written statement. It was detailed but direct. She confirmed 3 key points. First, the bullet trajectory showed a slight downward path from right to left, but the angle required the shooter to extend their arm unnaturally if self-inflicted, especially while seated. Second, the absence of stippling or soot meant the firearm had been fired from at least 12 inches away, possibly more. That ruled out most typical handgun suicides. Third, the blood spatter pattern on the floor and wall showed limited dispersion, inconsistent with expected force and angle for a self-inflicted headshot. There was too little chaos. Mendoza's conclusion was sharper than the state's. She wrote, "This injury pattern is not only inconsistent with self-infliction, but aligns more closely with an external firing position." The implications were clear. This wasn't about what Amy did. It was about what someone else likely did and how cleanly they'd done it. The investigators, now working under a sealed case label, reviewed the ballistic trajectory again using digital overlay tools. They plotted the casing ejection, projectile angle, and victim position. Each time, the conclusion landed near the same point. The shooter stood to Amy's right, slightly behind her. That position contradicted Brian's statement of being in the bathroom during the shot. He'd said he heard it, but his own smartwatch logged elevated pulse and a sharp movement pattern seconds before the call was made, far more consistent with initiating a physical act than reacting to one. And then there was the weapon. The Glock 21, issued to Brian as part of his department gear, had been cleaned recently. That wasn't unusual on its own. Officers are expected to maintain their firearms. But investigators noted that the slide had been disassembled and re-oiled within 72 hours of the shooting. A firearm maintenance log was missing from Brian's field kit, though required by department policy. The internal audit of the gun found no abnormality, no forced tampering. But the fact that it had been cleaned so soon after a fatal incident and logged without entry added another weight on the scale. It wasn't proof, but it wasn't invisible either. In the meantime, Amy's personal effects, her planner, phone, emails, and private draft were reviewed again, this time for language patterning. A linguistic analyst flagged a series of phrases in her emails that suggested cognitive dissonance. The drafts included lines like, "I know he loves God, but not me. And I keep hearing that I should forgive, but I don't know what I'm forgiving yet." These weren't declarations. They were confessions of fear, of moral conflict, of restraint. As the case file grew, so did the tension inside the task force. No arrest had been made. The community didn't know what the investigators knew. And to an outsider, the delay could look like hesitancy. But the team understood. Cases involving police officers weren't just about burden of proof. They were about eliminating doubt, doubt that could be weaponized in court. The DA's office scheduled a formal review panel for late August. The question wasn't whether the death was suspicious anymore. It was whether they had enough to make that suspicion hold up under scrutiny, on the record, before a jury. Back at the office, one investigator wrote in his case notes, "If this is a suicide, it's the cleanest one I've ever seen. And that's the problem." By September 2018, the case file against Brian Fanion no longer looked like a tragedy with questions. It looked like a prosecutable homicide, but the shift from suspicion to formal accusation required more than confidence. It demanded control. The Hampton County District Attorney's Office convened a pre-indictment strategy team behind closed doors. Present were senior prosecutors, 2 outside forensic consultants, the lead state investigator, and 1 digital forensics analyst. Their objective wasn't debate, it was durability. Could this case stand through cross-examination, media exposure, and the skepticism that follows whenever a law enforcement officer is named as a suspect? The findings were reviewed in sequence. The lack of gunshot residue, the bullet's unnatural angle, the absence of soot or stippling, Amy's planner entries, the deleted text threads, the smartwatch motion spike, the search terms on Brian's browser, and now the independent forensic report confirming that the shot couldn't have been self-inflicted without substantial physical contortion. Each point by itself was not enough, but together they held shape, and that shape was no longer abstract. What concerned prosecutors most wasn't the strength of the evidence. It was the risk of a defense narrative built on reasonable doubt. Brian had no criminal record. His personnel file was clean. He had served decades without formal complaint. A defense could claim a rushed conclusion, a misread scene, an emotional family projecting grief as blame. To counter that, the DA's team prepared an investigative hold strategy. Rather than issue a warrant or arrest publicly, they began a silent review of Brian's financials, insurance policies, firearm logs, and personal calendar going back 18 months. They wanted a buffer, something irrefutable, rooted in his own choices. That led them to one document, a retirement benefits application filed in April 2018. It indicated intent to retire later that year, unusual given his age and lack of disciplinary record. On its own, it might have meant nothing, but attached to it was a handwritten notation, dated April 23rd. Final transition, do not delay beyond June. That date was just weeks before Amy's death. Investigators also began informal tailing. Fanion wasn't under arrest, but he was being watched. He met regularly with Corey Knowles, but their contact remained mostly private and cautious. No outward signs of criminal intent. No statements suggesting complicity. Still, the fact that their relationship continued, despite the known scrutiny, raised concerns about potential narrative alignment. In late October, investigators recovered surveillance footage from a gas station located near the Fanion residence, time-stamped at 12:05 p.m. on May 8th, the day of Amy's death. It showed Brian's department vehicle returning from lunch. He had no passengers. His face, caught briefly in the reflection of the glass, was unreadable, but it confirmed his timeline. 12 minutes later, Amy's phone stopped transmitting data. 13 minutes after that, dispatch received the 911 call. With no other persons observed entering or leaving the home in that window, and with trajectory modeling indicating an angle impossible for Amy to create herself without aid, the prosecution saw their frame, tight, traceable, and insulated from outside tampering. On November 2, 2018, the DA's office submitted a sealed indictment request to the grand jury. The charge was murder in the first degree. The court granted approval. The arrest would not be made public until the following morning. That night, as the indictment order was processed, an assistant DA reviewed the case summary one last time. He noted something that would never make it into testimony, but stayed in his notes. Everything we've got points to precision, the scene, the gun, the timing. It wasn't rage, it was execution. Quiet, practiced, and personal. On the morning of November 3, 2018, at precisely 6:42 a.m., investigators executed the arrest warrant for Brian Fanion. He was taken into custody without resistance at his Westfield residence, the same house where Amy Fanion had died 6 months earlier. The arrest wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, planned, and recorded. Standard procedure, but this wasn't a standard case. It was the first time in recent Massachusetts history that a homicide indictment had been handed down against a sitting or recently retired law enforcement officer, based primarily on forensic and digital inconsistencies, without a confession, without eyewitnesses. Brian was processed at the Hampton County Correctional Facility. He was formally charged with first-degree murder under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 265. Bail was denied based on the seriousness of the charge and the calculated nature of the alleged offense. He was placed on a no-contact order with all members of Amy's family and suspended retroactively from retirement pension eligibility pending outcome of the trial. The official announcement came hours later at a press conference. District Attorney Anthony Gallooni stood at a podium in front of a crowded room of media representatives. He didn't sensationalize. His statement was factual. We believe the evidence will show that this was not a spontaneous act, nor was it a suicide. It was a planned, deliberate act intended to mislead and conceal the truth. Public reaction was immediate. Within days, local outlets began circulating segments about Amy Fanion, her community involvement, her volunteer work, her absence. For the first time, her name wasn't just part of an affidavit, it was a person again. And in that recognition, the story shifted from procedure to consequence. Inside the courtroom, the defense wasted no time shaping its strategy. Brian's attorney argued that the state had no direct evidence, no weapon tampering, no eyewitness, no confession. The defense team leaned heavily on his decades-long service record and the idea that grief can manifest in unexpected behavior. They pushed back against the forensic findings, claiming the trajectory modeling was speculative and that GSR absence wasn't proof of innocence or guilt. What they could not refute, however, was the data, the deleted messages, the Google searches, the smartwatch movement, the unsigned retirement paperwork, the forensic inconsistencies that didn't add up to suicide, and the sequence of events that had become too precise to ignore. The prosecution worked methodically. Their timeline was anchored in immutable data points, device activity, pathologist statements, ballistic trajectories, and cross-referenced with real-world behaviors, unlogged firearm maintenance, the timing of browser searches, the reformatting of devices. Witnesses were prepped. Amy's brother, a neighbor, Corey Knowles, co-workers. The language used in court was specific, never dramatic, but underneath the factual delivery was the constant pulse of motive, control, convenience, reinvention. A significant moment came during the evidentiary hearing in January 2019, when a forensic audio expert testified on the 911 call. While nothing about the call had been previously deemed unusual, the analyst flagged something subtle. The caller's voice showed no signs of acute stress response, no pitch elevation, no vocal tremor, no pauses typical in shock state speakers. This wasn't definitive evidence, but it reinforced a theme: preparation. The defense tried to reframe the call as the stoicism of a trained officer. But under cross-examination, the expert made one point clear: The voice sounded like someone who already knew what had happened, not someone who had just discovered it. In court, Amy's family sat quietly, occupying the first two benches on the left. They did not make public statements. They didn't have to. The prosecution's work was speaking for them. As pretrial proceedings advanced, the weight of the case was no longer legal. It was personal. For the investigators, the lab technicians, the prosecutors, it had become about more than proving a crime. It was about holding a line, that justice doesn't make exceptions based on uniform or title, that trust can't be allowed to mask truth. The judge scheduled trial for March 2023. The courtroom in Springfield opened to quiet on February 6, 2023. There were no press outbursts, no protesters lining the hall, just two rows of a family who had waited nearly 5 years for a courtroom to say what they already believed. At the defense table sat Brian Fanyon, retired Westfield police detective, accused of murdering his wife Amy inside their home using his service weapon. The prosecution didn't rely on theatrics. Their strategy was built on sequence, not just what was done, but when and how the timing proved control. They opened with the physical impossibility of the shot. No stippling, no contact wound, and an angle that couldn't be self-inflicted from a seated position. The ballistic trajectory modeling, demonstrated using 3D renderings in front of the jury, reinforced that the bullet's path, from entry to exit to wall impact, didn't match suicide. Next came digital forensics. A lead analyst walked the court through the timeline. Browser history, deleted texts, iCloud backups. No speculation, just logs. The jury saw text messages exchanged with Corey Knowles in the weeks leading up to Amy's death. They were emotional, sometimes intimate, and several made vague references to things getting easier soon. These weren't declarations of guilt, but in context they formed a backdrop for motive. One message, timestamped May 7, 2018, just a day before the shooting, read, "Tomorrow I just need peace. I need space again." The state's strongest moment came during the testimony of Dr. Carla Mendoza, the independent forensic pathologist brought in after the initial autopsy. She delivered her findings calmly, referencing photographs, wound dimensions, and the angle of the shot. "This is not consistent with a self-inflicted wound," she stated. "It reflects external application, deliberate and close but not contact." The defense attempted to discredit the modeling and shift focus to Brian's decades of service. They argued that grief manifests in strange ways, that deleting messages wasn't a crime, that absence of gunshot residue didn't mean the victim hadn't fired the weapon. They emphasized that Brian had no prior record, that he cooperated with investigators early on, and that he made the 911 call himself. They described him as a man of discipline, caught in a personal collapse. But as the testimony progressed, their narrative couldn't close the gaps. The prosecution reminded the jury that Amy's phone stopped recording data at 12:13 p.m., exactly 1 minute before Brian placed the emergency call, that his smartwatch recorded a spike in arm motion at the same time, that the weapon had been cleaned, that Amy had a dentist appointment scheduled 2 days later, that she had been researching canning recipes. A final expert, an audio forensics specialist, analyzed Brian's call to emergency services. There was no panic, no tremble, no spontaneous speech errors. It was, in the words of the analyst, calculated, linear, and consistent with someone who had time to prepare a statement. Brian did not testify. Closing arguments lasted less than 2 hours. The jury was excused at 11:16 a.m. They returned at 5:02 p.m. the same day. Guilty, first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Brian did not flinch. He stood still, as he had in the field for years, watching others account for consequences. This time, it was his turn. The sentence was immediate: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amy's family declined to make a public statement, but her brother submitted a short written remark. "We weren't looking for revenge, just truth, and we're grateful that truth finally had a place to stand." Brian was transferred to MCI Cedar Junction to begin his sentence. The Westfield Police Department issued a 1-paragraph press release acknowledging the verdict and offering condolences to the Fanyon family. Internally, they began a review of officer wellness protocols and response procedures in domestic situations involving department-issued firearms. Quiet reforms prompted by one silent death. In the months that followed, the case became part of local academy ethics training, not as a scandal, but as a study in oversight, data, and the reality that authority is not immunity. Prosecutors emphasized the diligence required when investigating those trained to hide evidence, even unintentionally. Detectives noted that trust doesn't replace verification, not in marriage, not in homicide. The house where Amy died was sold in 2024. New owners repainted the walls, but neighbors said the street had never quite returned to normal. The lawn that Amy once trimmed was now overgrown, a visual pause in a neighborhood otherwise manicured. In cases like this, justice doesn't feel clean. It's procedural. It's technical. It doesn't bring closure so much as clarity. And for investigators who stood over that bathroom floor in 2018, the real measure wasn't the conviction. It was that the process didn't rush, didn't collapse under doubt, and didn't protect the wrong person just because of a badge. Amy Fanyon was buried without fanfare, but her story now stands in court records, forensic reports, and training slides, not just as a victim, but as the reason the system worked this time. What this case reminded me, more than anything, is how silence can bury the truth, but persistence can bring it back to light. I've seen too many people assume that certain titles, certain uniforms, mean someone is above suspicion. But justice, real justice, isn't about who you are. It's about what the evidence shows. If you take one thing from Amy's story, let it be this. Don't ignore your instincts, and don't let a quiet crime go unnoticed just because it happens behind respectable doors. Have you ever questioned something others were too afraid to? What would you have done differently in this case? I'd love to know where you're watching from and how this story resonated with you. If this video made you think, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next case we break down together.